One of the biggest and recurrent themes that we see throughout this course is questions about the role of government in U.S. society, whether that involves the economy, whether that involves bringing about equality in terms of gender or race or whatnot. How did the role of government change in U.S. history? Just to do a very short synopsis of what we talked about up until this point. We began this class by talking about the Gilded Age, and we talked about during that period in U.S. history something known as laissez-faire economics as the guiding light of U.S. government economic policies. Essentially a hands-off approach that allowed these robber barons like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller to accumulate massive sums of money while at the same time not doing enough to protect the workers. The government essentially denied the workers an equal playing field to battle these robber barons. Well, then we talked about a sort of blowback in the reform movements of the 1880s and 1890s, whether that be the labor unions, whether that be the populist movement. But as we also talked about, by the mid-1890s, what we will see take place is, in terms of labor unions, the American Federation of Labor reigned supreme. And that was a more reformist organization. And then on the other hand, we see the Populist Party, which in their 1892 platform had called for the nationalization of the railroads and giving power back to the people. Well, as that went on, by 1896, that movement would basically be taken in by the Democrats when William Jennings Bryan ran as both a populist and Democratic Party candidate in the 1896 election. So finally, we will get to the progressive movement, where again it seems that there's a call for an expanded role in governing. Well, this is to an extent successful, but not everything that they wanted, because of course the Progressive Party would not win the presidency in the 1912 election. Theodore Roosevelt, its candidate, would not defeat Woodrow Wilson, and therefore when Woodrow Wilson became president, he would borrow some of the progressive issues that the Progressive Party called for, but there still was a limited role for government. And what we will see is this is particularly the case in the 1920s, when you are going to see the Republicans take hold of power, and eventually, as we'll talk about at the beginning of this lecture, you are going to see someone like Herbert Hoover basically bringing back and rehabilitating that laissez-faire economics, which only leads to the worsening of the Great Depression. But then finally, with the New Deal, with the coming to power in 1933, of Franklin Roosevelt, we see for the first time in history, really, the U.S. government playing an activist, assertive role in the economy, in labor, and various other aspects of American life. I want to talk here about the origins of the Great Depression. And it began on October 24th, 1929, when the stock market plummeted $10 billion, which in today's money is about $100 billion. And this was lost just in a matter of hours. Investors sold their stocks at breakneck speeds as the price of these stocks declined. Shares of U.S. Steel dropped from $262 to $22. So here was one of the pinnacle companies in the United States, led by one of those robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, seeing its stock drop from $262 to just $22. General Motors automobile production had been a huge factor in America's growing economy in the early 20th century. General Motors stock went from $73 to $8 a share. The slide was halted momentarily when several wealthy bankers used money from their own personal fortunes and the reserves of private banks to purchase stocks at inflated prices beyond their current low value. This was in an effort to basically artificially inflate the stocks so that this would prop them up and other people would follow suit and purchase these stocks at these inflated prices. Well, the only problem is this was basically putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound, and these private efforts were a dramatic failure, and we saw the continued precipitous decline of the U.S. stock market. So you have to ask yourself the question, why? what happened in the preceding years, particularly in the 1920s, that led to this Great Depression breaking out in October 1929. It was several things. There is no one factor that led to the outbreak of the Depression. Rather, several of these economic factors led to its outbreak. First of all, to begin with, overproduction, combined with declining consumption, resulted in a glut of consumer goods. Additionally, President Herbert Hoover sought to promote greater consumption of American goods by passing a law for the highest tariffs in U.S. history. These tariffs were known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. So tariffs, as you know, are essentially taxes. And what he was doing is Hoover was putting these sky-high taxes on all imported products into the United States, hoping that this would therefore open up the market for U.S. produced goods, and therefore people would only buy U.S. produced goods. Well, as it turned out, this backfired on Herbert Hoover as foreign nations responded by setting similarly high tariffs. So what did this mean? It now meant that yes, U.S. domestic consumption of U.S. made products was up, but foreign consumption, foreign imports of U.S. goods were dramatically down, as American exports were now curtailed because of this basically back and forth of nations setting up these high tariffs that is ending free trade. Due to these tariffs, in fact, what we will see is international trade dropped from about $36 billion in 1929 all the way to just $12 billion in 1932. American exports alone during this time fell by about 78%. I want to look now briefly at this unemployment chart, because what it does is it shows us very clearly what is going to happen in this Great Depression. So I want to mark out these numbers because even though on the screen they are just numbers, they do tell a story that we're going to fill out in the rest of this lecture. But I, again, want to use these numbers to sort of set the course of this story. So we have the years 1929 to 1941. So when the Great Depression begins, we have about 1.5 million unemployed, just over 3% of the labor force, a 3.14% unemployment rate. But very quickly, over the next 4 years, and these 4 years are being led, the United States is being led by the Republican President Herbert Hoover. And what these numbers show us is that his policies are clearly not working, because by 1933, unemployment will reach its Great Depression high of over 12.8 million people, or just under 25% of the American workforce. A quarter of the American workforce is unemployed by the time Democrat Franklin Roosevelt, takes the helm and implements his New Deal. So now let's look at this. We don't know anything about the New Deal yet. We're going to talk about that later in this lecture. But just by the numbers that we see on the screen, does it look like the New Deal was successful? Well, in fact it does, because within a year of Franklin Roosevelt coming into office and initiating his New Deal programs, what we see is that unemployment will fall 3%, about 1.5 million. It will continue to decline, but at the same time, look at this important year here, 1937, 1938. You're going to see an uptick during that year, particularly in 1938, 18.9% unemployment, about 10.3 million. Why did we see that incline? Well, as we're going to see at the end of this class, Franklin Roosevelt himself was concerned about keeping a balanced budget. And there was also pressure from both within the Democratic Party and among Republicans that the United States needed to keep its house in order and not have too much of a not to have too much of a deficit. So therefore, he cut spending in 1937, 1938. What were the repercussions of that? It was increased unemployment again. The other point that I want to make in finishing up our discussion here of this unemployment chart, if we look at the numbers, we only see them go down back into single digits beginning in 1941. So if any of you know just the minimum of U.S. history, you might know that, of course, in 1941, particularly December 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor happens and the United States enters World War II. But even before that, beginning especially in 1940, the United States becomes the arsenal of democracy, as we'll talk about, and begins a massive production of military equipment to send to the Allies fighting in World War II before the United States becomes involved. Therefore, I want to make this point very clear. What we see is this. We see World War II and war production ending the Great Depression. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression, partially because basically Franklin Roosevelt had self-imposed and also externally set his own limits that did not allow him to spend as much as he may have wanted or even as he wished to with the Great Depression, with the New Deal to end the Great Depression. However, these shackles were torn off, these handcuffs were opened up, and with World War II coming about, he was allowed to spend freely, and that is what ended the Great Depression. Besides unemployment, what was it like to actually live and experience the Great Depression? Well, many people were fearful as they lost their jobs that their life savings would disappear. So therefore, they ran to the banks in droves to withdraw their money from these financial institutes. And if any of you have ever seen the movie, the Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, you see that one scene where you see people running into George Bailey's bank, and they are basically asking for him to give them their money because of this very fear. They believe that their money will no longer be available the following day, so there is a rush on the banks, and they attempt to go and take this money out of the banks. So as a result, a bank can obviously not exist if it does not have a basic foundation of capital in its possession. So therefore, as more and more people are taking more and more money out of the banks, we see a massive number of bank closures. In 1930 alone, 1,352 banks closed. In 1932, that number would rise up to about 2,300 banks that would close that year. Farmers, too, faced an unbearable series of problems. But here's the thing. It wasn't only the economic situation that they had to deal with, but it was also an issue that stemmed from Mother Nature herself. But first, the economic issue. Because if we look at the years between 1929 and 1932, farmers' income dropped by 2/3. By early 1933, there were about 20,000 farm foreclosures per month. Added to this indignity, Mother Nature made conditions even worse, as I alluded to a couple seconds ago. Large areas of the South, the Southwest, and in the Great Plains did not receive any measurable rainfall for a 6-year period between 1930 and 1936. This was known as the Dust Bowl, and it was just terrible conditions. You can see here on the map the area that was hit hardest. You have the panhandle of Oklahoma, and then you have northern Texas, but really all the way up from North Dakota to the Mexican border, down south to the Mexican border, you see these areas that were damaged by these dust storms. And these dust storms were terrible. They basically created these massive waves of dust that sometimes covered people's houses. Obviously, this was getting into people's lungs, and it was destroying livestock. It was destroying plants. And this dust got so bad that it eventually would reach areas across the United States as it was being blown across the country to Chicago, to New York City. And you can see the image on the right of this screen, just how it engulfed an entire land. And people were dying, obviously, because it was getting into their lungs. It was causing health problems. So what did a lot of people do during this time? Well, as you can see on the map, they decided they were going to get out of there. They decided that they were going to go west and go out to California, where they believed there was lush and fertile lands that they would be able to grow crops on and make a living. If any of you have ever read the book or seen the movie The Grapes of Wrath, that really details how tough it was for a lot of these Okies, as they were known, because they were coming largely from Oklahoma, to make their way west, only to find that the fortunes in California were not much better, because obviously the entire country was facing a Great Depression. And this was just a terrible, terrible time to be a farmer. You're losing money, you're losing your homes. You have to leave your homestead, and you have to move west, again, only to find more death and destitution as you move your way out to that area. So in short, the people were looking for a change, and the people needed some action in Washington. But the only problem is the man in the White House, Republican Herbert Hoover, was unwilling to take action and fundamentally change the role of government to end this Great Depression. With the exception of the tariff reform, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, Hoover took a hands-off approach, believing that government intervention would worsen the crisis by discouraging the work ethic of Americans. So this is why, as you can see on the screen, I say laissez-faire government was alive and well in the late 1920s and early 1930s. What we see Hoover do during this time is trying to maintain a balanced budget and rely on voluntary action to end the Great Depression. To this end, he signed the Revenue Act of 1932, which represented the highest peacetime tax increase in history. So, I mean, just think about someone who would do this as president. The nation is in the pits because of this tremendous economic depression, and here we have the president so concerned about having any sort of budget shortfall or budget deficit that he is actually going to increase taxes to their highest rate in U.S. history. Well, Hoover also advocated what was known as associationalism. And this theory held that voluntary cooperative organizations would provide economic assistance and services to the needy, and thus made government intervention unnecessary. Rather than provide unemployment insurance or poor relief, Hoover tried to persuade corporations not to lay off workers and contribute some of their profits to the homeless and unemployed charities. Well, clearly, the whole purpose of private corporations, as we talked about the corporatization of America in one of the earlier lectures, corporations in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, their sole purpose was profit, private profit. So therefore, it was fanciful and unrealistic for Hoover to expect that these private corporations would actually be willing to give up to some of their profit to provide economic assistance and services to the needy, thus making government intervention unnecessary. So therefore, what we see during this time is conditions would continue to worsen and worsen. And as they did, the public would become very vocal in blaming Herbert Hoover as the reason for their struggles. And in fact, it would be so bad that a lot of these homeless camps that were set up by unemployed Americans, they would become known as Hoovervilles, as sort of a dig against this president, this do-nothing, see-nothing president, Herbert Hoover, who was unwilling to use the power of the federal government to ease the burden facing these workers or these unemployed during the Great Depression. Things would change somewhat in 1932, importantly in an election year for Herbert Hoover, because what we see is when the federal government finally offers assistance in that year, it goes a different direction than most people thought, in that it often went to industry. We see this, in fact, in the 1932 Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which essentially was meant to provide up to $2 billion in federal loans to banks, life insurance companies, and railroads. The Hoover administration believed that these benefits to corporations would trickle down to average Americans and thus make unemployment relief unnecessary. And we can see this in a quote that comes from the Secretary of the Treasury, Ogden Mills, on unemployment relief from a statement he made in December of 1932. He said the following: "I want to break the ice by lending to industry so that somebody will begin to spend some money." So basically, they're going to grease the wheels of industry, but the only problem is that grease and that money never trickles down to the people who need it most. Rather, a lot of these corporations, whether it be the banks, the insurance companies, or the railroad companies that get this money, keep it, they do not spend it, they do not invest it, so therefore it never does actually trickle down. Well, in the same year, 1932, Herbert Hoover would finally take some action, but it was far too little and it was far too late to secure his re-election as president in 1932. And this last-ditch effort was something known as the Relief and Reconstruction Act. And what this did was it authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to finance up to $1.5 billion for states to set up public works projects, but this fell greatly short. And as a result, what we see is the 1932 election pitting Herbert Hoover, the existing president who many people are very critical of, hence the name the Hoovervilles, against a wealthy elite, a man who is relatively unknown by most Americans, but nonetheless who had some positions of power in the past that gave him some influence, and that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Organizationally, what we are going to do in this lecture is we are going to divide the New Deal into two parts, the first New Deal and the second New Deal. And what we're going to see is the second New Deal is far more radical than was the first New Deal that we're going to talk about now, due in part to pressure that Franklin Roosevelt is receiving during this period in the mid-1930s from competitors seeking his throne at the White House. But nonetheless, we'll get to that second New Deal. First, we have to touch, obviously, on this first New Deal. So FDR's first task as president involved making the nation's banks viable again. So therefore, the people would trust these banks and they would be willing to put their money into them as deposits, and these banks would not close down. To this end, Franklin Roosevelt instituted a 4-day bank holiday, closing the bank to get things in order. During this bank holiday, Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The Emergency Banking Relief Act, which gave the federal government greater regulatory powers over banks. Also during this bank holiday, and inspired by Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat as president, the American public would basically get a boost in confidence. They would listen to this man, Franklin Roosevelt, speaking to them in one of these fireside chats. And if I can set the scene for you, just how personal this was for a lot of Americans, it was almost as if the president was with them in their house, experiencing the same things as they were. He was very persuasive, was Franklin Roosevelt, in these fireside chats. And therefore, he was telling the American people, you can trust in this federal government, now under the helm of Franklin Roosevelt, that we will look out for you and we will protect your investments and we will protect your money that you put in the bank. Do not worry about it. We will stand with you. So as a result of this, more and more people started to deposit their money. So therefore, Franklin Roosevelt can now move on to other banking issues beyond getting the consumer's confidence back up in the banks. And we would see this in June. In June of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Banking Act. And the Banking Act included two important provisions. First, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, also known as FDIC. And if you walk into a bank, even up until the present day, at least you should see this if you walk into a bank up until the present day, you'll see this sticker, the FDIC. And what this simply means is that the federal government guaranteed customer savings accounts at that time up to $2,500. In today's market, it's a lot more, but nonetheless, it's again an effort to tell the American people, we the government have your back. If you happen to lose your money and the bank goes under, we will return that money. We will insure that money. Secondly, and more importantly, and this will have ramifications for stuff that happens well into the 21st century, the other part of this Banking Act was the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act, What this did was it prohibited banks from investing the savings of depositors in the stock market. This is what happened a lot during the stock market run of the 1920s, where these savings banks that were supposed to be devoted primarily to holding people's money and providing loans for people to buy things like houses, they started betting their customers' money on the stock market. So therefore, when the stock market fell, the banks no longer had these savings and loans in their safe, and therefore then they could not give it back to the people. The people no longer had confidence in their banks, therefore the run on the banks, and this same old story that we've been talking about all this class. So therefore, with this Glass-Steagall Act, these banks, these savings and loans banks, would no longer be able to play the money in the stock market. Only investment banks could invest in the stock market, not commercial banks. So after we have this reform of the banking system, we move on to relief. Relief in general, relief for rural Americans, and relief for industrial workers. So I want to turn here to, first of all, FDR's moves to help relieve the unemployed and the poor in America. In March of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And you're going to hear me during this class. I've already said the FDIC, now I moved on to the CCC. This is what historians call the alphabet soup of the New Deal. You have all these myriad different programs with all these acronyms. So try to stay with me as I'm moving through all these different things. But again, basically what we see Franklin Roosevelt doing is he is very pragmatic. He is basically throwing stuff at a wall, and whatever sticks, whatever program sticks and works, he's going to keep. Whatever doesn't, he's going to get rid of, and that's the end of it. So nonetheless, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, would hire unemployed workers to plant forests, deal with soil erosion, as well as other conservation and beautification projects. By mid-1933, 1,500 camps housed over 250,000 workers who did things like building the Appalachian Trail up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. So we can clearly see the success of the CCC. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, provided federal monies to state unemployment agencies to care for the unemployed. So now we see essentially the states being funneled money by the federal government to provide aid to the unemployed. Next, we'll see the Public Works Administration. The Public Works Administration provided $3.3 billion in federal monies to states to build infrastructure, including for things like bridges, tunnels, libraries, and public housing. 34,000 projects were completed by the Public Works Administration, including down in Kentucky, if you've ever driven through there, the Blue Ridge Parkway. So in short, what I'm saying here is this CCC and the PWA, they were meant to simply provide jobs, but at the same time they created the infrastructure that is actually still around in many places throughout the United States. Well, next, after this general relief, Franklin Roosevelt would focus on providing relief to agricultural workers. And we see this in helping the plight of the farmers when FDR signed in 1933 the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to kill their pigs, dump gallons of milk, and destroy their fields so that the prices of these commodities would go up. But here's the only thing. If we think about this from a very logical perspective and a very basic perspective, many critics question these policies given the level of hunger throughout the United States. Moreover, another problem with the Agricultural Adjustment Act is that if you remember in one of the past classes, we talked about how a lot of farmers did not actually own their land. They were sharecroppers. So the problem with the Agricultural Adjustment Act was that the money often went to the landowners and not the sharecroppers that lost their jobs when the land was left to lay fallow so that it would no longer grow. So in short, yes, the AAA was important, but it led a lot of people to scratch their head, again, saying there are a lot of poor and hungry people who could use this food. Why are we throwing it away? And then also, is it really getting to the farmers that actually need it? The final area that I want to talk about is the relief for industrial workers. And this gets back to, again, what we talked about during the late 19th century when we were talking about the Gilded Age and the attempts by labor unions and workers to fight back. Well, one of the problems that labor unions had is that their unions and the right to collectively bargain, to negotiate with employers, was not a recognized right by the federal government. And this would really plague their efforts to obtain a hearing with their employers. They basically had no power. Well, this would change slowly but surely. And the first effort that was made by Franklin Roosevelt was with the National Industrial Recovery Act. The National Industrial Recovery Act, which allowed businesses overseen by the National Recovery Administration to work together to create these codes. And these codes would set pricing, production, and wages. Now back to the part about unions. Section 7A said the following: industrial workers have the right to, quote, organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing. But what the problem was with this section is, in addition to having federal regulation of maximum hours and minimum wages, workers were allowed to join unions. But unlike the maximum hours and minimum wages, the idea with the union was it was optional. Companies were not penalized if they did not negotiate with the unions. So therefore, it was very much a toothless rule. Moreover, in 1935, NERO was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Why? Because the Supreme Court argued that it empowered the federal government to regulate working conditions in firms that did not cross lines and therefore partake in interstate commerce. According to the U.S. Constitution, the federal government can only intervene in economic issues that is interstate commerce across state borders. Despite the tremendous success of the New Deal, and it was a success in the sense that we saw, going back to that slide on unemployment, it was going down in the mid-1930s. But for certain Americans, the New Deal had not gone far enough. And what we see is we start to see an opposition growing to the New Deal, seeking something more elaborate and more extreme than what Franklin Roosevelt was provided. And one figure in particular, whose document you're reading for this week, really stood out among all of Franklin Roosevelt's critics. And that was Huey Long, a former governor of Louisiana and then a senator for that state, who couched his appeals in populism, speaking for the people, the everyday average American. By the 1930s, populism came to contrast the virtues of this average ordinary American, the people, with the evil of greedy, wealthy elites. So he would really play up this idea that he was going to be the everyman's king. Originally, he was actually supportive of the New Deal, was Huey Long. But he came to believe that FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, did not do enough to weaken the financiers and corporate leaders. Therefore, to achieve his goal of spreading the wealth, Huey Long launched the Share Our Wealth Society. Illustrative of the support of such a program, 27,000 Share Our Wealth clubs sprang up across the country, composed of as many as 5 million members. So this was clearly a widespread favorite idea, and you can see why in the document. Some of the things that he was calling for would prove very attractive to a lot of people who were struggling to make ends meet here in the Great Depression. Well, as this was going on, Huey Long was undoubtedly laying the groundwork for a run for the presidency against Franklin Roosevelt. You can see that in the speech, in the image here on the right. We have Huey Long in the character of Robin Hood, if you will, who's basically saying, you take my place tooting on these pipes and I'll drop out. Basically telling Franklin Roosevelt, you pick up my Share My Wealth program and I will basically bow out and not run against you in 1936. Well, as it turned out, Huey Long would be shot and killed by an assassin in 1935, and he would not be able to contest the 1936 election. But nonetheless, the efforts of Huey Long, Charles Coughlin, Upton Sinclair, and several other figures who were again criticizing Franklin Roosevelt for not going far enough in his first New Deal would eventually encourage Franklin Roosevelt to step up and say, okay, I'm going to do more, and I am going to actually change various institutions with my second New Deal. Whereas the first New Deal that was carried out from about 1933 to 1934 involved primarily reviving and rehabilitating the banking system and providing relief, we see this second New Deal being far more expansive, as its intention is to be more of a job creator. And we see this in terms of one of the most important programs of the Second New Deal that took place here from 1935 to 1936, something known as the Works Projects Administration, the WPA. This carried out public works projects, including building 500,000 miles of highways, nearly 100,000 bridges, and 8,000 parks. It put to work about 8.5 million Americans, all at a cost of a staggering $11 billion. Most importantly, this, unlike the first New Deal where the federal government funneled unemployment insurance and funding through the states, this program would involve the federal government directly hiring the workers. Nonetheless, the criticisms pointed toward his administration led FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, to pursue stronger measures to end the Great Depression in the 2 years before the 1936 election. Therefore, and to this end, in response to the ruling that the National Industrial Recovery Act was unconstitutional, Franklin Roosevelt signed in 1935 the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, after one of its leading authors, a senator from the state of New York, Wagner. And what this did was, for the first time in U.S. history, it didn't just suggest that unions should be recognized by companies and involved in collective bargaining, but rather it protected the rights of workers to unionize as well as participate in strikes. And most importantly, not only would unions be doing these things and being allowed to do these things, but they were also, this act, the Wagner Act, required companies to negotiate with labor unions. Another expansive program, another one that is also still around up until the present day, is the Social Security Act. You'll have the document by one of the again, authors of this idea and formulators of this idea in the set of documents that we're reading for this week, but nonetheless, for our purposes here, it's simply enough to say that this provided old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to children and old folks. In fact, this one was a direct response to what we would see another critic of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, Charles Townsend, but also in the Huey Long document as well, you'll see this, a call for old age insurance. That was obviously part of this, along with the unemployment insurance and aid to children and old folks. Now, here's the important thing, because even though Franklin Roosevelt wanted to make this program expansive, he knew that he had to deal with conservative opposition within Congress. So therefore, as you'll notice up into the present day, if you look at your statement from your wages, you will see that along with taxes taken out, you will see Social Security benefits taken out from these things as well. So therefore, the money for this program, the Social Security Act, would come from workers' paychecks, not the federal government. But nonetheless, as you can see on the right hand of the screen, these programs would help propel Franklin Roosevelt to re-election in 1936 in a landslide. As you can see, he won all but 2 states, as well as gaining a huge majority in the Congress to further continue, at least it would seem, further continue his program of the New Deal. The only problem is that when the Democrats won a tremendous majority in Congress in the 1936 elections, as well as Roosevelt being reelected as president, A lot of these Democrats were from the South, and these Southern Democrats were very conservative. So as a result of this, they would continue, especially even more so as their power was boosted after 1936, they would continue to put pressure on Franklin Roosevelt to reduce government expenditures. And again, just to refer back to a comment that I made at the start of this lecture, Roosevelt himself was always inclined towards a more balanced budget approach to government finances. So therefore, this will all come together to lead to a backing off of the Second New Deal and the New Deal in general in 1937. And what will be the consequences of that? The consequences will be what historians and journalists at that time called the Roosevelt Recession. And we saw this in the unemployment chart that we looked at earlier in this lecture, where as soon as Roosevelt cut back spending in 1937, unemployment would rise again in 1938. So as a result of massive government intervention in the economy, America's unemployment rate reached its lowest level in 4 years in 1937. However, then comes this pivotal moment in June 1937, when Roosevelt, worried about inflation, slashed spending sharply. In doing so, Roosevelt seemed to be stepping back from a Keynesian approach to economics. I want to talk about what this was, this idea of Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, and he argued that the government needed to spend lavishly in hard times and tax heavily in prosperous times. Well, obviously the Depression was as hard as times as you could get, so therefore these Keynesian economists in Franklin Roosevelt's administration, they pushed for priming the pump and basically greasing the wheels of government and the economy by instituting massive government spending. Well, to make matters worse, as these Keynesian economists sort of were pushed to the side, you would see again a group of powerful conservative Democratic senators begin openly and vocally opposing Roosevelt and his New Deal programs. And this went as high up as Franklin Roosevelt's own Vice President, John Nance Garner. These conservative Democrats demanded low federal spending and deficits. Thus, even as Roosevelt, in response to the rising unemployment in 1938, even as Roosevelt increased spending again in 1938, it was not at the same levels as earlier in his presidency, and in fact, it never would be. Again, to refer back to a point that I made earlier in our lecture, the only time that it ever was bumped back up and well beyond, in fact, what was spent on domestic programs with the New Deal was with the coming of World War II and preparation for that conflict, as we will see in future classes. But nonetheless, here we see an important juncture in U.S. history. Yes, government is expanded for the first time in history to unforeseen levels, but at the same time, even here, when it's at its pinnacle, the growth of government is at its pinnacle, we see forces within and outside of the U.S. government saying too much government is not a good thing. So there will always be, essentially, for the rest of this class, this constant battle between the Keynesian economists and the conservative economists who are saying we need to cut back in government spending. And we'll see more about that, again, throughout the rest of this course, essentially.